He had the mansion, the luxury cars, the kind of last name that turned locked gates into open doors. But behind the polished smile, his world was falling apart. Grades slipping, friends fading, even his father's pride crumbling into disappointment. Everyone had already written him off as a failure in designer shoes. Until one morning, in the dustiest corner of the old school library, an aging janitor and her blind German shepherd crossed his path. He thought she was invisible, just mopping floors while the dog wandered quietly at her side. He had no idea she was about to teach him how to see what his eyes never could. Chicago's early winter had always carried a kind of sharpness in the air, a cold wind that rattled through the steel canyons of skyscrapers and pressed its chill against every exposed cheek. That morning was no exception. A pale sky stretched over the city like a washed-out canvas, streaked with thin clouds that refused to let the sun shine through. The streets glistened with patches of melted frost, and the breath of commuters billowed like smoke as they hurried toward trains and buses. Somewhere in the affluent northern district, behind tall iron gates and marble walls, 17-year-old Ethan Walker dragged himself out of a bed that had cost more than some people's cars. Ethan was tall for his age, 6 feet already, though his frame leaned thin from too many missed meals replaced with energy drinks. His hair was a dark blonde, perpetually tousled as if he had just stepped out of a photo shoot, though, in truth, he rarely bothered with a comb. His eyes were a pale gray blue, often half-lidded in boredom, giving him the look of someone permanently unimpressed with the world. He wore what he always wore, an oversized gray hoodie with the hood nearly swallowing his head, torn black jeans that cost more than an entire outfit at a regular department store, and spotless sneakers from a limited collection. On the surface, he looked like the archetype of careless youth, but his posture carried a weight of entitlement. Ethan Walker wasn't just anyone. He was the only son of Richard Walker, a billionaire real estate tycoon who owned half of downtown Chicago's skyline. Yet, despite the money, Ethan's life felt like a collapsing tower. He had failed 3 exams in the last week alone. His GPA hovered near the bottom of his class, and every teacher in the elite private academy he attended either despised him or feared his father's influence too much to confront him. He had grown accustomed to mocking their authority, confident that money could buy forgiveness, but his father had reached his limit. Just the night before, in the cavernous living room of their mansion, Richard had stood with his silver hair slicked back, dressed in an expensive suit even at home, his face carved from stone. "You're done driving that Audi," he had said coldly. "I cut the cards. From now on, you take the bus like everyone else. If you want to live like a child, then travel like one." The words had stung more than Ethan admitted. That morning, for the first time in years, he found himself waiting at a bus stop with other students, his hands stuffed deep in the pocket of his hoodie, staring at the ground as if daring anyone to speak to him. When the yellow school bus rattled to a halt and hissed its doors open, Ethan stepped aboard, ignoring the chatter around him. He sank into a seat near the back, slipping his headphones on though no music played. He wanted distance. The ride through the city streets stretched endlessly, past gray apartment blocks, boarded-up stores, and finally the sprawling campus of Westbridge Academy, the most prestigious private high school in Chicago. The bus wheezed to a stop in the faculty lot, far less glamorous than the gleaming cars Ethan used to park beside. His face hardened, a smirk plastered over his humiliation, as though daring the world to laugh. He shoved the doors open and walked through the cold morning air, his sneakers crunching on salted pavement. It was then, by the side entrance near the old brick gymnasium, that he noticed her. A woman in her mid-50s, her back slightly bent, yet her posture composed, was mopping the tiles near the doorway. Grace Miller was not the kind of person most students spared a glance for. Her uniform was a pale blue jumpsuit, faded at the seams, and her shoes were practical black slip-ons worn smooth by years of labor. Her hair was chestnut-streaked heavily with silver, tied back in a loose knot. Lines framed her eyes, but rather than exhaustion, they spoke of endurance, of someone who had faced storms without flinching. Grace's gaze, when she lifted it briefly from her work, was steady and piercing, the sort of gaze that could disarm arrogance without a single word. To most, she was invisible, a janitor, background noise in the marble corridors of privilege. To Ethan, she was a reminder of everything beneath him. He glanced once, smirked, and walked past as if she were a shadow. At her side moved a figure that immediately caught the eye. Not a person, but a dog. Shadow, a German shepherd nearly 8 years old, padded along with slow, careful steps. His fur was a mottled mix of gray and black, once sleek but now dusted with age. A white cloth covered his eyes like a bandage, tied carefully behind his head. Blindness had stolen his sight years before, yet his ears flicked attentively to every sound, and his nose twitched, mapping the world through scent. Despite his disability, there was a calm nobility about him, a quiet confidence that made it clear this was no ordinary pet. Once, long ago, Shadow had been a rescue dog, trained to find survivors under rubble. Now he stayed close to Grace, moving with her as naturally as her own shadow. Students sometimes whispered about the strange sight of a blind dog wandering the halls, but most ignored him, just as they ignored Grace. Ethan, seeing them both, chuckled under his breath and thought of them as scenery, mere brushstrokes in a background painting to the portrait of his life. Inside the building, the polished floors and gleaming trophy cases reflected Ethan's aloof stride. Students eyed him with a mix of envy and disdain. They knew who he was, the rich boy who didn't care, who failed every test and still strutted through the halls as though he owned them. Ethan loved and loathed their stares in equal measure. They reminded him that he was still someone, even as his father tried to strip him of that illusion. But Ethan wasn't the only one carrying burdens. That morning, in a classroom down the hall sat Jake Turner, another 17-year-old, though a world apart from Ethan in circumstance. Jake's hair was chestnut brown, perpetually messy, and his skin carried the faint tan of someone who spent hours working outdoors. He wore a button-up shirt faded from too many washes, the cuffs frayed, tucked sloppily into jeans. His sneakers were worn thin, the soles patched with tape. Jake's family had little. His father, once a soldier, had passed away years ago, and his mother, frail and often bedridden, struggled with mounting medical bills. Jake worked evenings at a corner grocery store, stocking shelves until midnight, then dragging himself home to study by the dim light of a second-hand lamp. His classmates rarely noticed him, except to whisper about his clothes or his silence. But behind his tired eyes burned a quiet determination. He was fighting for a scholarship, his only chance to attend college and pull his family out of poverty. Jake's path and Ethan's had always run parallel, but never crossed. One, the child of unimaginable wealth who wasted opportunities without a thought. The other, the son of hardship, clinging desperately to every chance he could find. That morning, though, fate nudged them a step closer. As Ethan strode past Grace and Shadow with disdain, Jake lingered at the same doorway, pausing long enough to nod politely at the janitor. Grace returned the nod with a faint smile, her hand still steady on the mop. Shadow lifted his head as if acknowledging Jake's quiet respect. Ethan saw none of it. He was already gone, lost in his own arrogance. By the time the first bell rang, the winter sun had broken weakly through the clouds, casting a pale light across the city. In the classrooms of Westbridge Academy, lessons began, lectures droned, and tests were handed out. Ethan leaned back in his chair, smirking, confident that grades meant nothing when one was born with a name like Walker. Jake hunched over his desk, scribbling furiously, determined to squeeze every point he could from the paper before him. Grace, in the hallway, pushed her mop bucket along in silence, her eyes calm but watchful. Shadow padded at her side, ears tuned to the rhythm of a world most others ignored. And so, within the marble walls of privilege, 3 lives brushed against each other in the quiet of an ordinary winter morning, one drowning in excess, one struggling in silence, and one unseen by nearly everyone, yet destined to change everything. The next week dragged forward under the dull light of Chicago's stubborn winter, each day beginning with gray skies and winds that whipped down the avenues like knives. The glass towers of downtown gleamed like cold steel, indifferent to the lives they overshadowed. At Westbridge Academy, where portraits of wealthy alumni lined the halls, 17-year-old Ethan Walker continued his performance of careless rebellion. Yet, beneath his hooded eyes and sarcastic smirk, something gnawed at him with quiet persistence. Ethan's grades had become a running joke among students and faculty alike. He failed a history quiz with a scrawled 27%, laughed when a science exam returned with a blood-red 18%, and leaned back smugly in his chair when the English teacher sighed and slid another F across his desk. He told himself it didn't matter. His father's money could buy opportunities that grades never could. Still, the laughter of his classmates stung sharper than he admitted. Even the ones who envied his sneakers mocked his ignorance in whispers. Every red mark on paper whispered failure, but Ethan drowned it with arrogance. It was on a bitter morning, the wind rattling windows like restless hands, that Ethan wandered the east hallway to avoid the crowd. The corridor was quiet, lined with lockers that gleamed under fluorescent lights. The smell of floor polish lingered. He was alone, or so he thought, until a low voice broke the silence. "The truth of life," the voice said, almost to itself, "is to be curious, not judgmental." Ethan slowed, brow furrowed. He turned to find Grace Miller, the janitor he had dismissed days before, her mop gliding across the tiles in steady arcs. Her chestnut and silver hair slipped loose from its knot, framing a face lined with years of endurance. She spoke as if reciting something to the walls, her eyes distant but calm. "What did you say?" Ethan muttered, half mocking, half unsettled. Grace looked up, her gaze steady. "Words you're not ready for." Ethan scoffed, but the phrase stuck like a splinter. Shadow, the German shepherd at her side, raised his head. Though blind, his instincts guided him forward, slow but certain. The dog's fur brushed against Ethan's leg before he settled at the boy's feet. Ethan froze. The weight of the dog's head pressed against his shin, steady and warm, like a wordless recognition. For a moment, Ethan felt seen in a way no teacher or parent had managed. He chuckled awkwardly and stepped back, muttering something about weird mutts. Yet the softness lingered. Later that day, Ethan slumped into a desk at the back of the gymnasium, where basketball tryouts were underway. He wasn't there to watch, but to kill time, hood drawn low over his eyes. The gym echoed with the squeak of sneakers and the sharp blast of a whistle. On the court, Jake Turner ran drills with relentless determination. Jake, 17 like Ethan, carried himself with a wiry strength built from hours of labor outside of school. His chestnut hair clung damp with sweat, his shirt clinging to his lean frame. Every stride screamed effort, every breath a vow. His sneakers were old, the soles nearly worn flat, but they slapped the hardwood with the sound of persistence. Jake was fighting for a scholarship, his one chance out of the cycle of poverty. The coach, Mr. Dalton, stood on the sidelines. A man in his early 40s, Dalton was thick-set, with a shaved head that gleamed under the gym lights. He wore a whistle around his neck and a perpetual scowl that carved into his square jaw. Dalton had once been a college player, but never reached the pros after a knee injury ended his career. Since then, bitterness had settled deep in his bones. He respected strength, but sneered at struggle. Jake finished his sprint and doubled over, hands on his knees, chest heaving. "Coach," he gasped, I want to try out for the scholarship team." Dalton's lips twisted into a cruel smile. He crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing at Jake's worn clothes, his exhaustion, the poverty written in his appearance. "Kid, save yourself the trouble. Those scholarships aren't for kids like you. They want winners, not desperate sob stories." Jake's face tightened, but he forced a grin. "I'll work harder than anyone." Dalton shook his head, already turning away. "You don't get it. Colleges don't gamble on losers from nowhere. You'll just waste their time." The words landed like a punch. Jake's grin cracked, his eyes reddened with the effort of holding back humiliation. He nodded stiffly, pretending not to care, but the tremor in his jaw betrayed him. From the bleachers, Ethan had watched the exchange, chin resting on his fist. He had come to sneer at the sweaty desperation of athletes, but instead, he saw something that unsettled him. Jake's pain was raw, unguarded, so unlike Ethan's carefully masked disdain. For a fleeting moment, Ethan imagined standing in that same place, dismissed for being worthless. The thought rattled him. He shifted uncomfortably, muttered something under his breath, and slipped out of the gym before Jake could see him watching. In the hallway, Ethan shoved his hands deep in his hoodie pocket and tried to shake the image. He told himself Jake was nothing to him, just another face in a school full of nobodies. Yet the echo of Dalton's voice, not for kids like you, clung to him, sharp and ugly. Ethan had always believed wealth insulated him from such contempt. But now, stripped of his car, his credit cards, his untouchable aura, he wasn't so sure. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the marble floors, Grace continued her work alone. The corridors emptied of chatter, lockers closed with dull clanks, and only the rhythmic swish of her mop filled the silence. Shadow padded at her side, his ears twitching as though tuned to an unseen rhythm. Ethan passed by again, his sneakers, squeaking faintly. He hesitated. "Hey," he said, voice low. "That thing you said earlier. What did it mean?" Grace paused, leaned on her mop handle, and studied him with those steady eyes. "It means," she said softly, "that judgment blinds us. Curiosity teaches us." Ethan scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sounds like fortune cookie nonsense." Grace almost smiled. "Then maybe you're not ready, but one day, maybe you will be." She turned back to her work, dismissing him with silence. Shadow, however, stepped forward once more, brushing against Ethan's leg before settling again at Grace's side. Ethan stared down at the blind dog, a knot forming in his throat he couldn't explain. He shook his head, shoved his hands deeper into his pockets, and walked away quickly, as though running from something fragile that scared him more than the failure ever had. Outside, the Chicago sky deepened into twilight, a smear of purple and gray stretching above the city. Ethan pulled his hood tighter against the cold, the words still circling in his mind like restless birds. Be curious, not judgmental. And though he would never admit it, the sentence had lodged itself inside him, waiting. The following week dawned with the same cold Chicago winds rattling through the canyons of glass and steel. But inside, Ethan Walker's something restless had begun to stir. For nights he had tried to silence it with video games, with idle scrolling through his phone, with sarcasm and laughter that sounded hollow, even to his own ears. But every time his head hit the pillow, the words returned, circling like ghosts. Be curious, not judgmental. He hated that they belonged to a janitor. He hated even more that they wouldn't leave him. On Monday morning, after another humiliating F on a math quiz, Ethan wandered through the hallways with his hoodie pulled low, chewing the inside of his cheek. He passed the side entrance where he had first heard Grace Miller's voice. She was there again, mop in hand, Shadow by her side, the blind dog listening as though he understood everything. Ethan stopped, hands buried in his pockets, and blurted out before pride could stop him. "Teach me," he said. Grace's mop paused mid-stroke. She looked up, eyes sharp and unreadable. Her hair had come loose from its knot again, streaks of silver falling against her cheek. "Teach you what?" she asked, her tone calm but edged with suspicion. "Anything, something. I don't know how to do this anymore," Ethan stammered. He hated how small his voice sounded. "I can't keep failing." Grace studied him, silent long enough that Ethan thought she might laugh. Finally, she set the mop aside. "If you want me to teach you, you leave your name at the door. You're not a walker here. You're just Ethan. And you start from zero, like Shadow, who sees not with eyes but with his heart." She gestured to the dog, who tilted his head as if affirming the command. Ethan swallowed, then nodded. "Fine. Just, please." That afternoon, Grace led him to the old library at the far end of campus. Once filled with shelves, it had long since been abandoned after a new digital media center was built. Dust clung to the wooden beams, and the scent of old paper lingered like a memory. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, painting fractured colors across the floor. It felt like a place forgotten by everyone else, a perfect refuge for someone trying to disappear. Shadow padded in first, nose twitching, circling until he settled near a battered armchair. Grace carried a canvas tote bag heavy with books, which she set on the table. Ethan dropped into a chair across from her, his hoodie still pulled tight, as if afraid someone would see. "Every morning," Grace said, pulling out a worn, leather-bound notebook, "you meet me here for 1 hour. You read, you ask questions, and at night, you write. Not about grades, not about assignments. Write what you feel, what you fear, what you don't understand. That notebook is honesty, not performance." She slid the notebook toward him. Ethan picked it up, flipping through the blank pages. His throat tightened. Blankness scared him more than failure. And if I fail at this too? Grace leaned back. Then you're finally doing it right. Shadow shifted, laying his head on Ethan's shoe. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't push the weight away. The next mornings followed a rhythm Ethan had never known. He arrived early, sometimes before the sun, slipping through side doors to the old library. Grace was always there before him, her posture upright, her expression composed. She asked questions that unsettled him. What did this line make you feel? Why do you think the character stayed silent? Can you tell me what courage sounds like? She didn't give answers. She pulled them out of him, like unearthing stones from soil. Ethan found himself writing at night. Awkward, messy confessions about the emptiness of wealth, the coldness of his father's voice, the hollow applause of classmates who feared his last name more than they respected him. Shadow sat beside him every session, ears twitching, occasionally pressing his muzzle against Ethan's knee when frustration overwhelmed him. Ethan found comfort in the blind dog's silent companionship. It was as though Shadow recognized his storms without judgment. Meanwhile, the life of Jake Turner unraveled further. Jake had been working longer shifts at the corner grocery to cover his mother's mounting hospital bills. His mother, Linda Turner, a thin woman in her 40s with soft brown hair dulled by illness, had been a nurse once. Years of long shifts and exhaustion had taken their toll until sickness left her bedridden. Despite her fragility, she spoke to Jake with warmth and encouragement, telling him not to give up his dream. But the weight on Jake's shoulders grew heavier by the day. At school, Jake often arrived with shadows under his eyes, his shirt untucked, his hair uncombed from lack of sleep. He fought to stay awake in class, scribbling notes with trembling hands. One afternoon, while the teacher lectured about the Civil War, Jake's head dropped against his desk. He didn't stir even when the class snickered. His breathing was shallow, his exhaustion complete. From the back row, Ethan noticed. He had been doodling in his notebook instead of listening, but the sight of Jake asleep hit him unexpectedly. For the first time, Ethan didn't see a nobody. He saw the price of survival etched in every weary line of Jake's face. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, torn between the urge to mock and a flicker of something else: recognition. Later, in the cafeteria, Ethan overheard two boys joking about Jake's mother's hospital visits. They laughed about charity cases and kids who'll never make it. Ethan didn't laugh. He walked away quickly, unsettled again, his chest heavy with something he couldn't name. That night, Ethan sat in his room, the notebook Grace had given him open on the desk. He stared at the blank page, pen trembling in his hand. Finally, he began to write. I saw a kid today. He's fighting for something. I don't even know what I'm fighting for. Maybe that's the difference between us. He's tired, but he keeps going. I'm full, but I keep quitting. Maybe I'm the one who's starving after all. When he closed the notebook, he didn't feel better, but he felt honest for the first time. The following morning, Ethan showed up early again. Grace read his words silently, her eyes softening. Good, she said. Not because it's pretty, because it's true. Ethan shifted in his seat, uncomfortable under her approval, but a part of him craved it. Shadow rested his chin on the table, his blind eyes hidden by the white cloth, his presence grounding. For the first time, Ethan wondered if maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. And so, in the forgotten library of Westbridge Academy, under the watch of a janitor who once had been a professor and a blind dog who saw more than most, Ethan Walker began again, this time from zero. The whispers started small, like drafts sneaking under locked doors, but in Westbridge Academy, gossip traveled with the speed of wildfire. By Wednesday morning, the rumor had become fact in the eyes of everyone. Ethan Walker, heir of skyscrapers and marble mansions, was being tutored by the janitor. It began with a shaky clip shot on someone's phone, Ethan entering the old library, a shadow of Grace Miller's mop, and the faint outline of Shadow's white cloth drifting past the doorway. Laughter filled the lunchroom when the video played, the caption written in bold, Walker's new professor, cleaning 101. Students smirked openly now. Some mimicked sweeping motions when Ethan passed. Others whispered, Professor Mop, loud enough for him to hear. Ethan tried to cover his discomfort with sneers and muttered insults, but the jeering clung to him like smoke. That afternoon in history class, someone slipped a drawing onto his desk, a stick figure in a hoodie being dragged along by a mop-wielding janitor and a blind dog. Ethan's jaw clenched, his pale gray-blue eyes flashing. He crumpled the paper, but the sound of suppressed giggles filled the room. For once, he didn't laugh with them. Later, in the hallway, Shadow brushed against his leg, calm and steady as ever. The touch steadied Ethan briefly, but then the sting of another voice cut through. Guess he finally found someone dumb enough to teach him. He turned sharply, his fists curling, but Grace's steady eyes met his from down the hall. She shook her head, a silent warning. Ethan exhaled hard, the fight draining out of him. That evening, he returned home to the Walker mansion, a fortress of glass and marble perched above the city. His father, Richard Walker, was waiting in the study, the room lined with leather-bound books no one read and portraits of ancestors painted to look sterner than they truly had been. Richard, 50 years old, with silver hair meticulously styled and a tailored suit even after hours, radiated authority like a second skin. His gaze was sharp, cutting through pretense with the efficiency of a scalpel. "You're embarrassing this family," Richard said without preamble, tossing a tablet onto the desk. The video of Ethan and Grace flickered on the screen. "My son, reduced to a laughingstock, taught by a janitor with a mutt for a sidekick. Do you realize what this does to our name?" Ethan shifted, his hoodie suddenly suffocating. "She's more of a teacher than anyone here has ever been." Richard's eyes narrowed, his voice like ice. "End it. Whatever nonsense you've been doing with her, it stops. Or you lose everything. No allowance, no car, no trust fund, no name. You'll walk out of this house with nothing but that hoodie and your arrogance." Ethan's throat tightened. He had always feared this line, the moment when threats would become reality. But something had shifted since the library, since Grace's gaze and Shadow's steady presence. He lifted his chin, forcing words out before fear could cage them. "Maybe I need to lose everything," he said quietly, "to figure out who I actually am." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes unreadable, but he said nothing more. Ethan turned, heart hammering, and left the room before his resolve could crumble. Meanwhile, the weight of survival dragged Jake Turner deeper into despair. His mother, Linda, had collapsed late one night, and now lay in the sterile whiteness of Saint Mary's Hospital, her breathing labored, machines humming a chorus of fragility. Jake, with his worn sneakers and threadbare jacket, sat beside her bed each evening after work, his head bowed in silent prayers that rarely found words. By day he stumbled through classes, exhaustion carved into his posture. The scholarship tryouts, once his hope, were abandoned. He told himself he didn't have time, but the truth was crueler. He didn't have belief left. One afternoon, Ethan saw him in the hallway, his steps dragging, his shoulders bowed as if carrying invisible stones. Something inside Ethan flared, recognition, empathy, perhaps guilt. For the first time, he didn't turn away. He reached into his bag and pulled out a torn page from his notebook, words scrawled in hurried handwriting. He stepped into Jake's path and pressed the paper into his palm. Jake blinked, surprised. "What's this?" Ethan avoided his eyes. "Read it later." Jake unfolded the paper when he was alone. The words were simple, but burned with sincerity. "True strength isn't in money. It's in standing up for someone else, even when the world tells you not to." E. Jake's fingers tightened around the page, his throat tightening. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket as though it were worth more than gold. That night, in the old library, Ethan arrived early. Grace was already there, her mop set aside, her bag of books open. Shadow lay curled at her feet, his blind eyes hidden beneath the white cloth, his ears flicking at Ethan's arrival. "They know?" Ethan muttered, slumping into a chair. "Everyone knows. They're laughing at me. My father, he gave me a choice. Stop this or lose everything." Grace studied him, her expression calm, unshaken. "And what will you choose?" Ethan's voice cracked, but he forced it steady. "I already did." For the first time, Grace smiled. Not wide, but enough to soften the lines of her face. "Then maybe you're closer to seeing than you realize." Shadow rose, walked to Ethan, and placed his head on his lap. Ethan's hand moved to the dog's fur almost unconsciously, grounding himself in the quiet warmth. And in that moment, though the world around him jeered and his father's empire threatened to collapse over his defiance, Ethan felt something unfamiliar but certain, the beginnings of freedom. The auditorium at Westbridge Academy had never felt so alive. Winter still clung to Chicago outside, but inside, warmth surged from the crowd gathered for the school's annual oratory contest. The vaulted ceiling trembled faintly with the buzz of whispers, the rustle of programs, the squeak of polished shoes against hardwood floors. Spotlights cut through the dimness, illuminating the stage where students would speak on the theme chosen by the faculty board: what it means to rise again. Parents filled the front rows in designer coats and glittering jewelry. Teachers sat primly at the sides, and students whispered in clumps, waiting to see who would stumble, who would shine. Near the aisle, Grace Miller sat quietly, wearing her faded work uniform, her chestnut and silver hair pulled neatly back. Her presence drew a few side glances, some disapproving, some curious. But she held her chin high. Beside her, Shadow, the blind German shepherd with his white cloth tied gently over his eyes, lay curled at her feet. Though he could not see, his ears twitched at every sound, as if absorbing the anticipation in the room. Behind the curtain, Ethan Walker tugged at the collar of his plain white shirt. For the first time in years, he wasn't dressed in brand names or flaunting sneakers that cost more than tuition fees. His black pants were simple, his shoes unremarkable. He looked ordinary, and that was the point. His gray-blue eyes reflected both fear and resolve. The old Ethan would have scoffed at such an event, dismissed it as beneath him. But now, as he held the worn notebook filled with Grace's questions and his own confessions, he felt something he had never allowed himself before: meaning. The announcer, Mrs. Avery, a tall, elegant woman in her 40s with auburn hair twisted into a bun, called his name. She was known for her meticulous fairness and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. A teacher who once believed Ethan incapable of more than arrogance. Her voice carried through the hall. Next, Ethan Walker. A hush fell, murmurs rippled. The Walker boy, the janitor's pet. Ethan stepped forward, the stage lights burning against his skin. For a moment, the weight of 1,000 stares threatened to crush him. Then he exhaled, gripped the lectern, and began. My name is Ethan Walker. Some of you know me as the kid who wasted every chance, who failed, who didn't care. And maybe you were right. His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. But someone saw me when no one else did. She wasn't a teacher in a classroom or a coach with a whistle. She was the woman who cleaned these halls, Grace Miller. Gasps and whispers scattered through the room, but Ethan's eyes didn't waver. She didn't just mop floors, she cleaned the darkness from my head. She told me to be curious, not judgmental. And then there was Shadow. He glanced toward the front row, where the dog lifted his head at the sound of his name. A blind dog who still sees more than I ever did, who taught me that sometimes you don't need eyes to recognize truth. Ethan paused, letting the silence grow. The hall seemed to lean closer, waiting. I learned that winning isn't about never falling. It's about rising again, with those who believe in you, rising with the ones who hold you steady when you stumble, who remind you who you could be. That's what it means to rise. His last words cut through the air like glass breaking. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then applause erupted, first hesitant, then thunderous, rolling through the hall like a wave. Students stood, parents clapped, some even wiped their eyes. Grace, in the front row, pressed her hand to her face, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Shadow raised his head, his blind eyes turned toward Ethan, and it seemed for a fleeting second that he was listening to the light itself. Ethan's voice steadied as he concluded. Today, I want to share a dream. A place called Shadow House. A center for students who feel invisible, who have been cast aside. A place where no one is judged for their failures, but lifted to rise again. I won't walk the path my father chose for me. This is my path. The applause surged louder, shaking the rafters. Grace covered her mouth, her tears now falling freely, while Shadow nudged her hand with his nose, as if to comfort her. In the audience, another name was called. Jake Turner. Jake, who had been sitting stiffly in the crowd, blinked in disbelief. He wore his best, an old button-up shirt ironed flat, jeans patched neatly, shoes scuffed but clean. Exhaustion still clung to him, but his chestnut hair had been combed, his posture straighter than usual. The principal, Mr. Harris, a broad-shouldered man with thinning blonde hair and a voice worn from years of assemblies, announced, "For perseverance and courage in the face of hardship, Westbridge Academy is awarding a special scholarship to Jake Turner." Jake's jaw dropped. He stood slowly, his eyes glistening as he walked to the stage. The crowd applauded again, and for the first time in years, Jake's smile wasn't forced. It spread naturally, disarming in its sincerity. He reached Ethan at the podium, and for a moment, the two boys simply looked at each other, the heir who had once mocked the world, and the fighter who had nearly given up. Then Jake extended his hand. Ethan clasped it firmly. The hall erupted in another cheer, not just for speeches or scholarships, but for something larger, change. Grace's tears blurred her vision, but she could see enough. Two boys, once worlds apart, now standing side by side. Shadow barked once, low and soft, as if in benediction. By evening, when the hall had emptied and the echo of applause lingered like incense, Ethan walked with Grace and Shadow through the quiet streets. The city lights glimmered above, reflecting off icy sidewalks. Ethan carried the notebook in his, hand, the same one filled with doubts and pain, now carrying a vision for the future. "I'm going to build Shadow House," he said firmly. "A place for kids like Jake, like me, like anyone who's ever felt unseen. And I want you there, Grace. And Shadow, too." Grace's steps slowed. She looked at him, the cold wind tangling silver strands of her hair. Her voice was husky with emotion. "Are you sure, Ethan? This won't be easy." He smiled faintly, the first real smile she had seen on him. "I've already fallen. Now it's time to rise." Shadow pressed against Ethan's leg, ears perked toward the distant hum of the city. It was as though, even in blindness, he sensed the light they were walking toward. And so it began. Not in boardrooms or bank vaults, but in the quiet promise of a boy, a woman, and a blind dog. That together they would build something greater than wealth. A place where falling was not the end, but the first step in rising again. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not the kind that parts seas or moves mountains, but the quiet one that happens inside a heart when it chooses to rise again. Ethan found a teacher in a woman the world ignored, and a guide in a blind dog who could see more than most. That is how God works. He places light in the most unexpected places to remind us that we are never truly lost. In our daily lives, we may pass by people who seem ordinary, or moments that feel small, but hidden inside them may be the very blessing that changes everything. If God could lift Ethan through Grace and Shadow, then He can lift us too. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment below. Tell us what you believe rising again means in your own life. And subscribe so you can join us for more journeys of faith and courage. And if you believe that God still places teachers and miracles in our path every day, write one simple word in the comments: Amen. May God bless you and keep you always.